The autumn breeze rustled through the trees outside Lincoln Heights High School as students hurried between classes. Kiana Thompson stood by her locker, adjusting her cardigan and checking her reflection in the small magnetic mirror. She was running late for her advanced placement history class, but she wanted to drop off some books at the library first. As she walked down the quiet hallway, her footsteps echoing against the lockers, she noticed Officer Richard Wilson watching her intently from his usual spot near the water fountain. Something about his gaze made her uncomfortable, but she kept walking, clutching her books closer to her chest. She'd seen him give similar looks to other black students before, but had managed to avoid any direct interaction with him until now. Just as Kiana reached for the library door, Officer Wilson's voice boomed through the hallway. "Hey, stop right there." His heavy footsteps approached rapidly from behind. Kiana froze, her heart pounding. She turned slowly, confused about what she could have done wrong. "Your sweater's too short. It's a dress code violation," Officer Wilson declared, his face stern and his hand already reaching for his handcuffs. Several students passing by stopped to watch the scene unfold. "But sir, I'm wearing a tank top underneath," Kiana explained calmly, pulling her cardigan closer. "And I've worn this outfit before. My teachers never said anything." Officer Wilson ignored her explanation. "Put your hands behind your back," he ordered, his voice growing louder. The small crowd of onlookers had grown larger, and phones were starting to come out of pockets. "This isn't necessary," Kiana protested, her voice trembling slightly. "I can just go change if there's really a problem." But Officer Wilson had already grabbed her arm roughly, causing her to drop her books. They scattered across the floor with a loud clatter that echoed through the now silent hallway. Ms. Chen, the library assistant, rushed out upon hearing the commotion. "What's going on here?" "Kiana is one of our best students." But Officer Wilson waved her away, already securing the handcuffs around Kiana's wrists. "Stay back, or you'll be interfering with police business," he snapped at Ms. Chen, who looked helplessly at the growing crowd of students recording the incident on their phones. Kiana stood there, fighting back tears as Officer Wilson roughly patted her down in front of everyone. Her classmates watched in shocked silence, their phones capturing every moment of the unnecessary arrest. Some were already texting and calling their parents, while others rapidly shared the videos on social media. "Please, you're hurting me," Kiana whispered as the handcuffs bit into her wrists. Officer Wilson responded by tightening them further, making her wince in pain. The school principal, Dr. Rivera, came running down the hallway, alerted by a concerned teacher. "Officer Wilson, this is completely unnecessary. Release her immediately." But Officer Wilson was already reading Kiana her rights, his voice filled with unnecessary authority. "You have the right to remain silent." He began marching her down the hallway, past her shocked classmates and teachers. What no one in that hallway knew, not even Officer Wilson, was that Kiana's mother had just been elected as the city's first black female mayor. She was currently in a transition meeting across town, preparing to take office in just 2 weeks. As Kiana was led through the school's main entrance, tears finally spilling down her cheeks, one of her closest friends, Lily, called Kiana's mom. The video of the arrest was already spreading across social media platforms, gaining hundreds of views by the minute. Students and teachers alike stood in stunned silence, watching through the school's large windows as Officer Wilson roughly pushed Kiana into the back of his patrol car. Ms. Chen hugged some of Kiana's crying friends, while Dr. Rivera was already on the phone with the school district's superintendent. The autumn breeze continued to rustle through the trees, carrying away the echo of slamming car doors and police sirens. In just 15 minutes, a simple trip to the library had turned into an incident that would soon shake the entire city to its core, exposing long-hidden tensions and forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and justice in their community. No one could have predicted that this moment, this unnecessary arrest of a bright, well-loved student, would become the catalyst for major changes in their city's approach to school safety and police reform. But as Officer Wilson's patrol car pulled away from the school, the wheels of change were already in motion, set spinning by dozens of witnesses with their phones held high, capturing truth in real time. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of City Hall as Mrs. Thompson sat in a transition meeting, reviewing budget proposals for her upcoming term as mayor. Her phone buzzed quietly on the conference table, but she ignored it, focusing on the presentation about infrastructure improvements. When it buzzed again and again, she finally glanced down to see multiple missed calls and messages. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw they were from her daughter's school. As she excused herself from the meeting and stepped into the hallway, her phone lit up with another call, this time from Kiana's best friend, Lily. The trembling voice on the other end made her blood run cold. "Mrs. Thompson, they arrested Kiana. Officer Wilson handcuffed her in front of everyone for no reason. We're all recording it, but he wouldn't listen to anyone, not even the principal." The newly elected mayor's hands began to shake as she watched the video Lily had sent. There was her daughter, her brilliant, kind-hearted Kiana, being handcuffed and manhandled by an officer over a supposed dress code violation. The same daughter who spent weekends volunteering at the local food bank and tutoring younger students. "I'm on my way," Mrs. Thompson said firmly, already heading for the elevator. Her heels clicked rapidly against the marble floor as she rushed through the building. Her security detail scrambled to keep up, but she was moving with the determination of a mother on a mission. In the car, more videos flooded her phone. Different angles of the same horrifying scene, each one making her heart ache more. She watched her daughter's dignity being stripped away in front of her peers, all because of one officer's prejudice. To the police station, she instructed her driver, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. As they drove, she made 3 calls, one to her lawyer, one to the current mayor, and one to the police chief. Each conversation was brief, professional, and carried the weight of her position as mayor-elect, though her hands still trembled as she spoke. At the station, Mrs. Thompson straightened her blazer and took a deep breath. She had walked through these doors many times as a civil rights attorney, but never as a mother whose child was behind them. The desk sergeant's eyes widened in recognition as she approached. "I'm here for my daughter, Kiana Thompson," she stated firmly, her voice carrying across the busy lobby. Several officers stopped what they were doing, suddenly very interested in their paperwork. "And I want to speak with Officer Wilson's supervising officer immediately." The station erupted into quiet chaos. Officers whispered among themselves as word spread that they had just arrested the mayor-elect's daughter. The police chief, who had been about to leave for lunch, turned his car around and headed back to the station. In a small holding area, Kiana sat with her wrists still bearing the marks from the handcuffs. When she saw her mother, she broke down, the brave face she'd been holding finally crumbling. Mrs. Thompson wrapped her arms around her daughter, her own tears threatening to fall. "Baby, are you hurt?" she whispered, checking Kiana's wrists and arms for bruises. "Did he hurt you?" "I'm okay, Mom," Kiana managed between sobs, but it was so humiliating. Everyone was watching. "I didn't do anything wrong." Mrs. Thompson held her daughter closer, her mind already racing with the changes she would implement once in office. But right now, she wasn't thinking as the future mayor. She was thinking as a mother whose child had been wronged. The police chief arrived, looking flustered and apologetic. Mrs. Thompson stood, keeping one arm around Kiana. "Chief Williams, we need to talk about what happened today, but first, I'm taking my daughter home. I expect Officer Wilson's body camera footage and all related reports on my desk first thing tomorrow morning." As they left the station, reporters were already gathering outside, drawn by the viral videos and the connection to the mayor-elect. Mrs. Thompson shielded Kiana from the cameras, her face set in a determined expression that those who knew her recognized well. It was the same look she'd worn while arguing civil rights cases in court, the same determination that had won her the mayoral election. In the car ride home, Kiana leaned against her mother's shoulder, emotionally exhausted. Mrs. Thompson stroked her daughter's hair, just as she had done when Kiana was small, but her mind was already working on how to turn this personal injustice into positive change for their community. Her phone continued to buzz with messages from concerned citizens, community leaders, and fellow politicians. The videos had gone viral, sparking outrage and calls for action. Mrs. Thompson knew this incident would define the beginning of her term as mayor, but not in the way Officer Wilson might have expected. As they pulled into their driveway, Mrs. Thompson looked at her daughter and made a silent promise. This wouldn't just be about punishment for one officer's actions, it would be about creating lasting change in the system that allowed such incidents to happen in the first place. The time for transformation had come, and it had started with her own daughter. By nightfall, the videos of Kiana's arrest had spread like wildfire across social media platforms. Local news stations ran the footage on their evening broadcasts, showing the shocking scene from multiple angles. The comment sections exploded with outrage as people recognized the intersection of racial bias and abuse of power playing out in their own community. Outside the Thompson home, news vans lined the quiet suburban street. Inside, Kiana sat curled up on the couch, her phone buzzing constantly with messages of support from classmates and community members. She had changed into comfortable clothes, but the memory of those handcuffs still lingered on her wrists. "Look at this, Mom," Kiana called out, her voice steadier now. She held up her phone, showing a social media post that had surfaced. It was an old complaint filed against Officer Wilson from 2 years ago, describing a similar incident with another student of color. More posts began emerging, revealing a pattern that had been ignored for far too long. Mrs. Thompson was in her home office, fielding calls from civil rights organizations and community leaders. Each conversation added another layer to the growing evidence of Officer Wilson's history of discriminatory behavior. Former students began sharing their own stories, each one painting a clearer picture of systemic issues within the school's security protocols. The current mayor called an emergency press conference, looking uncomfortable as he faced a barrage of questions about police oversight in schools. The police chief stood beside him, promising a thorough investigation, but their words rang hollow against the backdrop of the viral videos playing on every news channel. Local activists organized a peaceful protest outside the police station. Students from Lincoln Heights High School created an online petition demanding Officer Wilson's removal and reform of school security policies. Within hours, it had gathered thousands of signatures. Ms. Chen, the library assistant who had witnessed the arrest, gave an emotional interview to a local news station. "I've worked at this school for 15 years, she said, wiping away tears. "Kiana Thompson is one of our brightest students. What happened today wasn't about a dress code violation, it was about something much darker in our system." Dr. Rivera, the school principal, released a statement condemning the arrest and announcing an immediate review of all security protocols. The school board called an emergency meeting to discuss the future of police presence in their schools. As midnight approached, more revelations emerged. Someone found Officer Wilson's old social media posts, revealing a history of racially charged comments and concerning views about law enforcement authority. The posts spread rapidly, adding fuel to the growing demands for accountability. The police union released a statement defending Officer Wilson's actions, claiming he had followed standard procedures. This only intensified the public outrage, with many pointing out how a simple dress code issue had been escalated into an arrest without cause. In their living room, Kiana showed her mother another video that had surfaced, this one from 3 months ago, showing Officer Wilson aggressively confronting a group of minority students for gathering in the hallway between classes. The students had filed a complaint, but nothing had come of it. "How many times has this happened, Mom?" Kiana asked quietly. How many kids didn't have someone to stand up for them? Mrs. Thompson pulled her daughter close. "Too many," she answered. "But that's going to change now." The phone rang again. This time it was the superintendent of schools, calling to apologize and discuss immediate changes to school security policies. As Mrs. Thompson talked, Kiana opened her laptop and began writing about her experience. Her English teacher had always said writing could be healing, and now she understood why. Community leaders from various organizations began coordinating their efforts, planning town halls and forums to address the broader issues of racial profiling and police accountability. Local civil rights attorneys offered their services pro bono to help craft new policies and procedures. Around 2 a.m., long after most of the news vans had left, Mrs. Thompson found Kiana still awake, reading through messages of support from across the country. Some came from other students who had faced similar situations, others from parents worried about their own children's safety at school. "You should try to get some sleep, sweetheart," Mrs. Thompson said gently. "I will, Mom," Kiana replied, looking up from her phone. "But first, I want to write something. I think people need to hear this story from my perspective. Not just what happened today, but what it means. What it feels like to be seen as a threat just because of how you look." Mrs. Thompson nodded, recognizing the strength in her daughter's voice. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It had become a catalyst for change, a moment that would force their city to confront long-ignored issues of bias and accountability in their institutions. As the night wrapped its quiet arms around their neighborhood, mother and daughter sat together, typing out their thoughts and plans. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more cameras, more questions to answer. But for now, they found strength in each other and in the knowledge that their community was finally waking up to the need for real, lasting change. The incident that had started as a personal trauma was transforming into something bigger. A movement for justice that would ripple through their city and beyond, touching lives and changing systems that had remained unchanged for far too long. The internal affairs investigation began early the next morning, with investigators combing through years of complaints against Officer Wilson. In a sterile conference room at police headquarters, Lieutenant Parker spread out dozens of files across the table, each one telling a similar story of aggressive behavior and questionable judgment. "Look at this pattern," she said to her team, pointing to dates and incidents. Every single confrontation involved a student of color. Not one complaint about interactions with white students. Not one. Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson sat in her transition office, surrounded by legal advisors and civil rights experts. She'd barely slept, but her eyes were sharp and focused as she reviewed Officer Wilson's personnel file, which had been quietly delivered by a sympathetic officer from the records department. "He's had 3 transfers in 5 years, one advisor noted, flipping through the pages. Each time after complaints started piling up at his previous post. Someone's been protecting him, moving him around instead of addressing the problem." The investigation expanded beyond just Officer Wilson. Teams began examining security footage from school cameras, discovering numerous incidents where he'd singled out minority students for harsh treatment. Interviews with school staff revealed a history of complaints that had been dismissed or buried. In a small interview room, Ms. Chen recounted her observations over the past year. "He would stand in hallways where more minority students passed between classes," she explained. "He'd watch them differently, follow them sometimes. Many students started taking longer routes to class just to avoid him." Dr. Rivera, the school principal, provided emails showing he had raised concerns about Officer Wilson's behavior months ago. "The responses always focused on procedure and protocol," he said, pushing a stack of printed emails across the table. Nobody wanted to address the real issue. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered Officer Wilson's social media history had been partially scrubbed the night of Kiana's arrest. However, tech-savvy students had already archived many of his concerning posts, providing crucial evidence of his mindset and beliefs. The police chief ordered a complete audit of the department's response to previous complaints about Officer Wilson. The results were troubling. Multiple incidents had been downplayed or classified as minor infractions, despite clear evidence of excessive force and racial bias. Kiana, still processing her own experience, agreed to give a formal statement. In a quiet room with soft lighting, she spoke clearly into a recorder, describing every detail of her arrest. Her mother sat nearby, holding back tears as she heard the full story for the first time. "He didn't just hurt me physically," Kiana explained. "He tried to humiliate me, to make me feel powerless. But I'm not powerless. None of us are." Former students began coming forward with their own stories. One young man described being slammed against a locker for looking suspicious while getting books from his own locker. A young woman recalled being threatened with arrest for questioning why she was being followed between classes. The investigation revealed a broader system of negligence. Officers with complaints were routinely transferred between schools instead of being disciplined. Reports of racial bias were classified as personality conflicts. Training on cultural sensitivity and de-escalation was outdated and inadequate. Mrs. Thompson worked carefully behind the scenes, balancing her roles as a mother and incoming mayor. She provided information when asked but made sure to stay arm's length from the investigation to avoid any appearance of interference. "This isn't about revenge," she told her advisors. "It's about fixing a broken system. Every child deserves to feel safe at school." The investigation team discovered that Officer Wilson had attended several controversial police training seminars that promoted aggressive enforcement and military-style tactics in school settings. These programs had been criticized by education experts but were still being used to train school resource officers. As days passed, more evidence emerged. Security camera footage showed Officer Wilson ignoring similar dress code violations by non-minority students. Staff members reported hearing him make disparaging comments about minority students and their families. The investigation expanded to examine the entire school resource officer program. Records showed a disturbing pattern of disproportionate enforcement against minority students across multiple schools. Lieutenant Parker's team worked late into the night, piecing together a timeline of escalating behavior that should have raised red flags years ago. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't just about one bad officer, but about a system that had failed to protect its most vulnerable students. In her temporary office, Mrs. Thompson reviewed the preliminary findings with a heavy heart. The documentation revealed not just individual bias, but institutional failures at every level. The challenge ahead wasn't just about removing one officer, it was about rebuilding trust and creating real accountability. As the first phase of the investigation drew to a close, it was clear that Kiana's arrest had exposed deep-rooted problems that would require systemic changes to address. The question wasn't just what to do about Officer Wilson, but how to ensure this never happened to another student again. The investigation's findings would soon become public, forcing the city to confront uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and protection in their schools. But for now, investigators continued their methodical work, building an airtight case that would become the foundation for meaningful change. The police department's reckoning began on a rainy Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after Kiana's arrest. The chief of police called an all-hands meeting in the department's largest conference room. Officers packed the space, tension thick in the air as they waited for the internal affairs findings. Lieutenant Parker stood at the front, her expression grave as she clicked through slides showing years of documented bias. The room grew increasingly quiet as the evidence mounted, statistics, testimonies, and patterns that couldn't be explained away. "This isn't about one incident or one officer," she explained, her voice firm. "Our investigation revealed systemic issues that have been ignored for far too long. Over the past 5 years, minority students were 7 times more likely to face arrest or physical force in our schools." In the back of the room, veteran officers shifted uncomfortably as their own reports appeared on screen, showing clear patterns of discriminatory enforcement they'd overlooked or excused. The younger officers exchanged glances, some taking notes, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The department's training coordinator stood up, his face flushed. "We need to completely overhaul our school resource officer program," he admitted. "Our current training methods are outdated and potentially harmful. We've been teaching officers to treat schools like military zones instead of learning environments." Outside the police station, community members gathered for a peaceful demonstration. They carried signs showing support for Kiana while calling for departmental reform. Local teachers joined the crowd, sharing their own observations of how police presence had affected their students. Back inside, the chief announced immediate changes. Officer Wilson had been placed on administrative leave pending termination, but more importantly, the entire school resource officer program would be suspended for comprehensive review and restructuring. "We've lost the trust of our community," the chief acknowledged, his voice heavy with responsibility. "Earning it back will require more than just removing one officer. We need to change our entire approach to school safety." The police union representatives sat silently, knowing their usual defensive responses wouldn't work this time. The evidence was too clear, the public outrage too strong, and the momentum for change too powerful to resist. In another part of the city, the school board held an emergency session. Parents, teachers, and students filled the auditorium, each waiting their turn to speak. The stories they shared painted a picture of a system that had prioritized control over care, force over understanding. One veteran teacher broke down as she described watching her students develop anxiety about walking through certain hallways, knowing they might face harassment from officers who were supposed to protect them. "These are children," she reminded the board. "We're treating them like criminals before they've done anything wrong." The board members listened, many taking notes, others wiping away tears. By the end of the session, they had voted unanimously to create a community oversight committee for school security. The committee would include students, parents, teachers, and civil rights advocates. Back at the police department, officers began mandatory retraining sessions. The new curriculum focused on de-escalation techniques, cultural competency, and understanding teenage behavior. Many officers were surprised to learn how their presence and actions could traumatize young students. A young officer raised her hand during one session. "I became a school resource officer to help kids," she said, her voice cracking. "But now I see how her approach has been hurting the very students we're supposed to protect." The department's records office worked overtime, reviewing years of incident reports and complaints. They found dozens of cases similar to Kiana's that had been dismissed or downplayed. Each file represented a student whose trust in authority had been damaged, whose sense of safety at school had been compromised. Community leaders organized workshops where officers could hear directly from students and families affected by aggressive policing in schools. The sessions were emotional but productive, creating dialogue where there had only been confrontation before. In the department's break room, older officers shared stories with newer ones about how policing had changed over the years. Some admitted they'd become hardened, forgetting that their role was to serve and protect, not dominate and control. The internal investigation expanded to examine hiring practices, discovering that warnings about Officer Wilson's behavior had been ignored during his transfer process. The revelation led to the resignation of several senior officials who had failed to act on clear warning signs. As changes began taking shape, some officers resisted, clinging to old methods and mindsets. But most embraced the opportunity for improvement, recognizing that their effectiveness depended on community trust and cooperation. The city watched as its police department grappled with its failings and worked to transform itself. What had started with one student's unjust arrest was becoming a catalyst for meaningful reform, forcing long overdue conversations about race, power, and responsibility in law enforcement. By month's end, the department had new policies, new training requirements, and a new understanding of its role in schools. But more importantly, it had begun the difficult work of acknowledging its mistakes and committing to real change. The reckoning wasn't easy, but it was necessary. As one senior officer put it during a community meeting, "Sometimes it takes a mirror to show us what we've become. Now it's our job to become what our community needs us to be." Mrs. Thompson's inauguration day dawned bright and clear, but instead of a traditional ceremony, she chose to hold it in the high school auditorium where her daughter had been arrested just weeks before. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. This was where change would begin. The auditorium buzzed with energy as community members filled every seat. Students sat in the front rows, many wearing T-shirts with messages about justice and reform. Teachers, parents, and police officers mingled in the aisles, their usual boundaries dissolved by their shared purpose. After taking her oath of office, the new mayor stepped to the podium. "Today, we begin a new chapter," she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "What happened to my daughter was a wake-up call, but this isn't just about one incident. It's about building a city where every child feels safe, valued, and protected." She unveiled her comprehensive police reform package, developed through countless hours of community input. The changes went far beyond school security. They touched every aspect of how law enforcement interacted with the community. The first major change was the creation of a Youth Police Advisory Council. Students from every high school would meet regularly with police leadership to discuss concerns and suggest improvements. Kiana, watching from the front row, smiled as her mother explained how young voices would help shape police policies. Next came the announcement of mandatory monthly community engagement sessions for all officers. These wouldn't be formal meetings, but casual gatherings where officers could connect with residents over shared meals and activities. "We're breaking down walls," the new mayor explained. "When officers know the community they serve, when they see residents as neighbors rather than potential threats, everything changes." The police chief stepped forward to announce new training programs. Officers would spend time in classrooms not as authority figures, but as students, learning about teenage development, cultural awareness, and effective communication with young people. A veteran teacher stood to share her experience with the pilot program. "Last week, we had officers sit in on our classes," she said. "They saw how students interact, how they express themselves. One officer told me he wished he'd had this experience years ago. It completely changed his perspective." The reforms included a complete overhaul of the school resource officer program. Officers would now be selected based on their ability to connect with young people, not their command presence. Their uniforms would be less intimidating, and they would focus on building relationships rather than enforcing minor rules. "We're not removing security from schools," the mayor clarified. "We're redefining what security means. True safety comes from trust, understanding, and respect, not fear and force." The changes extended to the police department's hiring and promotion practices. Officers would now be evaluated on their community engagement skills and their ability to de-escalate situations. Those with a history of excessive force or bias wouldn't just be passed over, they'd be required to undergo intensive retraining. In the audience, Officer Wilson's former supervisor listened intently, thinking about the warning signs he'd ignored. The new policies would make it impossible to simply transfer problem officers to different locations. The mayor announced the creation of a civil rights division within the police department, staffed by attorneys and community advocates. They would review policies, investigate complaints, and ensure reforms were properly implemented. "This isn't about punishing police officers," she emphasized. "It's about giving them the tools and training they need to serve our community effectively. When officers have better resources and support, everyone benefits." The reforms included funding for mental health professionals to accompany officers on certain calls, particularly those involving young people. This would ensure that behavioral issues were handled appropriately rather than escalating to arrests. As the mayor concluded her speech, she invited her daughter to join her on stage. Hiana had become a symbol of the need for change, but she was also part of the solution, having helped design some of the new youth engagement programs. "Change isn't easy," the mayor acknowledged, her arm around her daughter. "But sometimes the most painful moments lead to the most important transformations. Today, we're not just reforming a police department, we're rebuilding trust, restoring dignity, and creating a model for other cities to follow." The audience rose in a standing ovation, not just for the speech, but for the promise of real change. Police officers and community members shook hands, students and teachers hugged, and there was a palpable sense that something significant was beginning. As people filed out of the auditorium, they'd pass tables where they could sign up for various community police partnership programs. Officers chatted with students about joining the Youth Advisory Council, while parents discussed hosting community dinners for their neighborhood patrol officers. The sun was setting as the last people left the building, casting long shadows across the school grounds. But unlike the shadows of the past, these seemed to point toward a brighter future, one where justice and compassion would guide the relationship between police and community. The reform package was just the beginning. The real work would happen in daily interactions, small changes, and countless moments of choosing understanding over fear. But for the first time in years, people felt hopeful about the possibility of real, lasting change in their city. 1 year later, the city had transformed in ways few could have imagined. The high school auditorium was once again filled to capacity, but this time for a different reason, a celebration of the changes that had taken root since that fateful day of Kiana's arrest. Hiana, now a senior, stood at the podium addressing a crowd of students, teachers, police officers, and community members. Her voice carried confidence as she shared statistics from the past year: 0 arrests in schools, a 90% decrease in disciplinary actions, and dramatically improved relationships between students and school resource officers. "A year ago, I was handcuffed in these halls," she said, her eyes scanning the crowd. "Today, I lead workshops where students and officers learn to understand each other. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives become the catalyst for the best changes." The new school resource officers sat in their modified uniforms, polo shirts and slacks rather than traditional police gear. They had become familiar faces in the hallways, known for offering help with homework and organizing basketball games rather than enforcing minor infractions. Mrs. Thompson watched from the side, pride evident in her eyes. Her first year as mayor had been challenging but transformative. The reforms she'd implemented had become a model for other cities, with delegations frequently visiting to study their success. The police chief stepped up to share his own reflection. "A year ago, we were part of the problem," he admitted. "Today, our officers don't just protect the community, they're part of it. Our graduation rate is up, juvenile arrests are down, and trust is being rebuilt, one interaction at a time." He highlighted the success of the Youth Police Advisory Council, where students like Kiana worked directly with officers to address concerns before they became problems. The council had become so effective that neighboring cities were creating similar programs. A series of photographs flashed on the screen behind them, officers attending student football games, helping with college applications, participating in community service projects. Each image told a story of barriers broken down and relationships built up. The teacher who had witnessed Kiana's arrest stood to share her perspective. "The change in atmosphere is remarkable," she said. "Students no longer walk the long way around to avoid certain hallways. They know our officers by name, trust them with problems, see them as allies rather than adversaries." The Civil Rights Division reported that complaints against officers had dropped by 85%. The new training programs and community engagement requirements had created a police force that better understood and respected the people they served. Former problem spots in the school had been transformed into community spaces. The hallway where Kiana was arrested now housed a student police mediation center where conflicts were resolved through dialogue rather than discipline. One of the new school resource officers shared his experience. "When I started this job, I thought it was about maintaining order," he said. "Now I understand it's about building relationships. Yesterday, a student trusted me enough to tell me about problems at home. That trust is worth more than any arrest record." The mayor's reforms had spread beyond the schools. Regular community dinners brought officers and residents together in informal settings. Police training now included extensive time in community settings, learning about the cultures and concerns of different neighborhoods. Kiana had become a powerful voice for youth advocacy, speaking at conferences and helping other cities implement similar changes. Her experience had transformed from a moment of trauma into a mission for change. Mrs. Thompson took the podium for the final words of the evening. "A year ago, we promised change," she said. "Today, we've delivered more than reform. We've created a new model of community policing. But our work isn't finished. Every day brings new challenges and opportunities to do better." The audience rose in applause, but this wasn't just polite acknowledgement. It was recognition of real change, of promises kept, of a community healing and growing stronger together. As people filed out of the auditorium, conversations buzzed with plans for the future, new programs to implement, more barriers to break down, additional ways to strengthen the bonds between police and community.